I never imagined my world could unravel in a single moment. My wife and I had been married for 6 years, and while our relationship wasn't perfect, I believed we were happy. She was my rock, my safe place, and the thought of betrayal never crossed my mind. Marriage isn't always easy, and we had our fair share of arguments and misunderstandings, but we always found our way back to each other. At least that's what I thought. That day started like any other. I was away on a short work trip, something that had become more frequent lately. My wife kissed me goodbye at the door, smiling sweetly as she told me to stay safe. I had no reason to question her sincerity, no reason to believe that anything was wrong. But looking back, maybe there were signs I ignored: her growing distance, the way she avoided eye contact sometimes, the late-night phone calls she said were from friends. It's strange how hindsight makes those tiny red flags so painfully obvious. My trip ended earlier than planned, and I decided to surprise her by coming home a day early. I remember feeling excited as I parked outside our house, imagining her face lighting up when she saw me walk through the door. I even brought her favorite flowers, thinking we'd spend the evening together, maybe have dinner, talk, and reconnect after the days apart. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The house was too quiet, almost unnaturally so. Usually she'd have music playing softly in the background, or I'd hear her humming from another room. Instead, there was silence. Then I noticed a pair of men's shoes near the front door. They weren't mine. My stomach twisted into knots, and my palms started to sweat. My mind raced through possible explanations, each one flimsier than the last. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had stopped by. But deep down I knew. A sinking feeling settled in my chest as I forced myself to move forward. I walked down the hallway toward our bedroom, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. With every step, the reality of what I might find became harder to ignore. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and from inside I could hear faint whispers and muffled laughter. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I froze. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to see what was on the other side of that door, because once I did, there'd be no turning back. But curiosity and suspicion pushed me forward. I placed my hand on the doorknob, hesitated for a brief second, and then pushed the door open. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. My wife was tangled in the sheets with another man. In our bed. In the space where we built memories, shared secrets, and promised loyalty to one another. The scene felt unreal, like I was watching a movie or having a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. They didn't even notice me at first. I stood there, frozen, my chest heaving as waves of disbelief and rage crashed over me. I wanted to scream, to tear the room apart, to make them feel the same agony that was ripping me apart from the inside. When they finally noticed me, the look on my wife's face wasn't one of regret or even shock, it was fear. And the man, he scrambled to cover himself, his face pale and eyes wide with panic. But nothing they could have said or done in that moment would have changed what I felt. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was the breaking of trust, the shattering of a bond I thought was unbreakable. The flowers I'd brought for her slipped from my hand and fell to the floor, forgotten in the chaos of that moment. I felt sick to my stomach, my mind racing with anger, sadness, and confusion. In that instant, something inside me snapped. The emotions hit me like a tidal wave: rage, heartbreak, humiliation. My chest felt tight, my vision blurred, and my hands shook as the weight of betrayal sank in. There's no way to describe the kind of anger that takes over when you see someone you love, someone you've trusted with every piece of your soul, shatter that trust so carelessly. It wasn't just about the act itself, it was about the lies, the secrecy, and the audacity to do it in our home, in our bed. The humiliation burned in my throat like acid, and every second I stood there felt like a lifetime. I couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My wife was saying something, I could see her lips moving, but the words didn't register. Was she apologizing? Was she trying to explain? It didn't matter. No excuse, no reasoning could have justified what I had walked in on. The man, her lover, wasn't much better. He was scrambling to gather his clothes, stumbling over his own feet, as if he thought he could escape the situation without consequences. The anger building inside me wasn't the quiet, simmering kind. It was blinding and raw, like wildfire spreading through my veins. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I stormed into the room, my voice erupting in a way I had never heard before. It wasn't just shouting, it was the sound of something breaking inside me, something I knew I'd never be able to repair. I demanded answers, though I knew none of them would satisfy me. My wife tried to approach me, her hands raised in some weak attempt to calm me down, but I stepped back. I didn't want her near me. I didn't want to hear her voice or see the face I had once adored looking so afraid of me now. My eyes locked onto the man, this stranger who had inserted himself into my life, into my marriage, into my home. He tried to speak, but I didn't let him. Who was he to explain anything to me? Who was he to justify invading something sacred to me? My fists clenched at my sides, and I felt like a bomb ticking down to zero. I couldn't think straight. My mind was chaos, and the only thing anchoring me was the searing pain of betrayal stabbing me over and over. I don't know when I left the room, but suddenly I was in the kitchen. My hands fumbled as I grabbed the first thing I saw, a kitchen knife. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't planning. I wasn't acting on instinct, on raw, primal fury. The knife felt cold and heavy in my hand, and as I gripped it tightly, I could feel my pulse throbbing in my fingertips. When I returned to the bedroom, everything felt surreal. The air was thick with tension, and both of them were staring at me. My wife's face was streaked with tears, her mouth trembling as she begged me to stop. The man was half-dressed, his eyes wide with terror as he slowly backed away. But there was nowhere to run. No door, no window could save him from the storm he had walked into. The moment that followed felt both instant and eternal. A part of me was watching from the outside as my hand moved, the blade flashing in the dim light. There was no thought, no hesitation, just action. His scream pierced the air, raw and guttural, as he collapsed to the floor. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading like an accusation, staining everything it touched. And then, silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on me from all sides. My wife's screams felt distant, muffled as if I were underwater. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my vision clouded by tears and adrenaline. The knife slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor with a sharp metallic ring. I stared at what I had done, at the irreversible damage my rage had caused. The reality of it began to creep in, cold and unrelenting. There was no taking it back, no rewinding time, no fixing this. The anger that had driven me moments before began to fade, replaced by something far heavier: regret. What happened next is still a blur. My mind was a mess, tangled with fragments of thoughts and flashes of reality that didn't feel real. The knife lay on the floor, blood smeared across the tiles, and the man was crumpled in agony, his screams filling every corner of the room. My wife was backed against the wall, her face pale, her hands covering her mouth as she sobbed uncontrollably. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, like time itself had fractured into sharp, jagged pieces. My hands were trembling, still slick with his blood. I couldn't look at them for too long without feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. I stumbled back, my breath hitching as I tried to process what I had just done. The man was writhing on the floor, clutching the space where his dignity had once been, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the horrific scene in front of me. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to be this person. My wife kept saying my name through her sobs, her voice trembling, cracking with fear and something else, pity maybe, or regret. But her voice felt distant, like an echo bouncing off the walls of a cave. I couldn't focus on her words, couldn't process the broken fragments of her voice pleading with me to do. What exactly? Stop? Fix it? There was no fixing this. The reality of my actions hit me like a sledgehammer. What had I done? This wasn't some fleeting moment of anger anymore, it was real, and it was irreversible. The consequences of this night were already cemented into my future. I had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed, no matter how much I wished I could take it all back. At some point I realized I needed to get out of the room. The smell of sweat, fear, and blood was suffocating me, making my stomach churn. I turned and stumbled out, my feet unsteady as if the floor beneath me was shifting. The hallway felt endless, the walls closing in on me as I made my way to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face, but the reflection staring back at me in the mirror was someone I didn't recognize. My eyes were wild, bloodshot, hollow. I looked like a man who had been stripped of everything that made him human. But there was still something I had to do. The severed part was still in the bedroom, lying there like some grotesque trophy of my blind rage. I grabbed a plastic bag from under the sink and walked back into the room. The man was still on the floor, his breathing shallow, his face twisted in agony. My wife was kneeling beside him, her hands pressed to his chest, her face wet with tears. Neither of them noticed me as I bent down, carefully picking up the evidence. The bag felt heavier than it should have as I tied it shut, my fingers fumbling over the knot. My mind was blank, operating on some autopilot survival mode. I knew I had to get rid of it. If the police found it, if anyone saw it, it would be over for me. Not that it wasn't already over, but some primal instinct told me to act, to move, to clean up what little I could. I slipped out of the house and into the night, the plastic bag clutched tightly in my hand. The air was cold, biting against my skin, but it didn't clear my head. My feet carried me forward, but I wasn't aware of where I was going until I reached the storm drain at the end of our street. I crouched down, pried open the metal grate, and dropped the bag inside. The sound of it hitting the water below was sickening, final. For a moment, I just stood there, staring down into the dark, filthy water, my breath fogged up in the cold night air, and for the first time, I felt the crushing weight of what I had done settle deep in my chest. There was no coming back from this, no undoing it. When I finally walked back to the house, my legs felt like they were made of lead. The sound of distant sirens started to echo in the night, and I knew deep down I wouldn't have much time left before everything came crashing down. The distant wail of sirens grew louder as I stood frozen in the doorway of my house. Every second stretched endlessly, each beat of my heart like a drum in my ears. My wife was still in the bedroom, kneeling on the blood-streaked floor beside him. Her face was ghostly pale, her tear-streaked cheeks glistening under the dull light. The man was still alive, barely, his body trembling as he clutched at the wound, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The smell of iron hung heavy in the air, and the room felt suffocating like the walls were closing in. I wanted to run, to disappear into the night and leave everything behind. But where would I go? What would I do? There was no escape from this, not really. Every decision I'd made in those past few minutes had led me here, and now there was no turning back. I stumbled into the living room, collapsing onto the couch, my head falling into my hands as I tried to slow my breathing. My shirt was stained with blood as blood is blood, and every time I looked down at my hands, I felt like I was staring at someone else's body. The sound of tires screeching outside jolted me upright. Red and blue lights flashed through the curtains, painting the walls in sharp, violent bursts of color. My stomach twisted into knots as I realized the police were already here. Shadows moved across the front yard, flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices barking orders I couldn't quite make out. This was it. The front door burst open, and officers flooded in, their weapons drawn, their voices sharp and commanding. Hands up. Don't move, I obeyed, slowly raising my trembling hands above my head. My wife's screams echoed faintly from the bedroom as more officers rushed past me, their boots thundering against the wooden floors. Everything was happening so fast, yet I felt detached, as though I was watching it all unfold from somewhere far away. Cold metal cuffs clicked around my wrists, biting into my skin. The officer holding me had a firm grip on my arm as he pulled me to my feet, his expression hard and unreadable. They asked me questions rapid, sharp like bullets, but I couldn't answer. My mouth felt dry and my throat tight. I wasn't sure if I was in shock or if my mind was simply refusing to process what was happening. From the corner of my eye, I saw paramedics rush into the bedroom, their voices urgent as they worked on the man I had mutilated. My wife was sitting on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, rocking back and forth as she sobbed. Her eyes met mine briefly as they led me out of the house, but she quickly looked away, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The night air hit me like a slap as they pushed me toward the waiting police car. The flashing lights reflected off the nearby houses, casting harsh shadows across their walls. Neighbors had started to gather, peeking out from behind curtains or standing on their porches in their night clothes, their faces etched with curiosity and fear. I wondered what they were thinking, what stories they'd tell each other tomorrow morning over coffee. As I was shoved into the back seat of the police car, the cold leather seat pressed against my back, and the metal barrier in front of me felt like a wall between me and the rest of the world. I stared straight ahead, unblinking, as the door slammed shut beside me. The muffled sounds of police radios and distant voices filled the silence, but I couldn't focus on any of it. The drive to the station felt endless. The streetlights passed in a rhythmic pattern, flickering across my face through the car window. My reflection stared back at me, hollow eyes, pale skin, and a haunted expression that made me look years older. I replayed the events of the night over and over in my head, each scene sharper than the last, each detail cutting deeper. The flowers I'd brought home, the shoes by the door, the whispers behind the bedroom door, the knife in my hand, the blood. At the station, I was led through cold hallways, my hands still cuffed behind my back. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on everything. They took my fingerprints, photographed me, and put me in a small gray interrogation room. The walls were bare, and the air was heavy with the stale smell of sweat and disinfectant. I sat there alone, staring at the table in front of me. My mind felt blank, yet painfully aware at the same time. Every sound, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of distant conversations felt amplified in the suffocating silence of that room. This was the point of no return. The moment where every decision I had made, every action I had taken, would be laid out in front of strangers who would pick it apart, piece by piece. And no matter what I said, no matter how I tried to explain it, the truth would remain the same. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Sitting in that cold, gray interrogation room felt like being trapped in a void. The walls pressed in on me, the hum of the fluorescent lights drilling into my skull. I had no sense of time. Minutes, hours, maybe even days seemed to blur together. My wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, the sharp edges biting into my skin every time I shifted. My mind replayed the night over and over like some broken record stuck on the most haunting parts. No matter how many times I closed my eyes, the images wouldn't fade, the blood pooling on the floor, the look on my wife's face, the sound of his scream. It was all carved into my memory, permanent and unyielding. The door creaked open, and a detective walked in, a worn-out notepad tucked under his arm. His face was tired, lined with experience and indifference, like he'd seen 1,000 men like me sitting in this very spot. He dropped the notepad on the table and sat down across from me. For a while he just stared, his eyes scanning me as if he was trying to see past the surface, past the blood-stained shirt and hollow eyes, into the chaos that was raging inside me. He started asking questions, slow, deliberate, and painfully direct. Why did I do it? Was it premeditated? Did I regret it? I wanted to answer, but every time I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? That I'd acted on blind, uncontrollable rage. That I'd seen red and couldn't stop myself. None of it felt like an explanation, none of it felt like enough. Eventually I muttered something about betrayal, about love turned sour, about the unbearable weight of walking into a scene that shattered every belief I had about my marriage. The detective scribbled something in his notepad, his pen scratching against the paper. His expression didn't change, didn't soften, and he didn't offer any words of comfort. Why would he? I wasn't the victim here, not in his eyes. In this room, under this light, I was nothing more than a man who had lost control, who had acted in a way society couldn't excuse. And honestly, I couldn't excuse myself either. Hours later, they processed me. Fingerprints, mugshots, paperwork, it all passed by in a haze. They put me in a holding cell with a metal bench and a flickering light overhead. The air smelled like sweat and bleach, and the faint sounds of distant voices echoed through the halls. I sat there with my head in my hands, trying to make sense of everything. But there was no sense to be made. I'd thrown away everything, my marriage, my freedom, my life, in a single moment of uncontrollable rage. The news spread quickly. By the next morning, my face was plastered across local news stations, accompanied by dramatic headlines recounting every gruesome detail. They didn't hold back graphic descriptions, speculation about my mental state, interviews with neighbors who described me as quiet. Where seemingly normal people love a story like this, it feeds something in them, some morbid curiosity about how far someone can be pushed before they snap. I thought about my wife, about how she must have felt when the police questioned her. Was she defending me? Was she condemning me? Or was she just breaking apart under the weight of everything? And him, the man I had mutilated, was he still alive? Would he survive? Would he ever be able to look at himself in the mirror again without remembering that night? Regret isn't a strong enough word for what I felt sitting in that cell. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at me from the inside out. The moment I picked up that knife, I'd set off a chain of events that could never be undone. And now all I had left were the echoes of my choices, reverberating through every corner of my mind. Eventually, they told me I'd be going to trial. The charges were severe attempted murder, aggravated assault, and a list of others that sounded heavy enough to crush me completely. The lawyer they assigned me tried to prepare me, tried to build some kind of defense, but I barely listened. What could they possibly say in my favor? That I'd been pushed too far. That I'd seen something no husband should ever have to see. It didn't matter. Nothing could change what had already been done. I knew where this road was headed: prison, years of confinement, maybe even a life sentence. The weight of it all sat on my chest like a stone, heavy and cold. I still see their faces, sometimes his face twisted in pain, her face frozen in shock and fear. They visit me in my sleep, in the silence of my cell, in the rare moments when my mind drifts away from the endless routine of prison life. The world outside kept moving, but for me, time stopped that night in our bedroom. No matter how many years pass, no matter how much I try to bury it, I'll always be stuck in that single, unforgiving moment. And the worst part, I know I have no one to blame but myself.